Today's sermon topic was selected by church member Paula Siegel. She won the right to this sermon by being one of the high bidders at our annual auction, where we auction off a sermon topic. I want to be upfront. I am not a scholar of the history of the indigenous peoples of California. I am not even a beginner in understanding its history. So Paula, I will do my best, but I apologize in advance for any generalizations I make or if any of my words offend. This sermon shares but a few snippets of a vast history of the Yokuts. It is a meager morsel of a far greater feast that awaits those who delve into the story of their past and their present. A land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many Native nations and communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native peoples and non-Native peoples to recognize indigenous peoples who are the original stewards of the land on which we now live. But for land acknowledgements to have meaning beyond the symbolic, it requires that we, at the very least, come to know something about the indigenous people whose lands and lives were colonized. Even better, a land acknowledgement is a precursor to developing relationships with the current indigenous stewards of the land. It can also be an invitation to support financially or become involved with indigenous-led social justice movements and organizations. Our land acknowledgement is also a way of honoring the indigenous heritage of members of our own congregation. And so, we acknowledge that our Alluvial Avenue Church campus sits within the traditional homelands of the Yokuts, the past, present, and future stewards of this land. I quote the Tachi Yokuts as I say, the indigenous people of the San Joaquin Valley were and are known as Yokuts. The word Yokuts means people. The Yokuts were unique among California natives in that they were divided into true tribes. Each had a name, a language, and a territory. As you can see in green, the Yokuts' land stretched from the Sacramento-San Joaquin River Delta in the north to Bakersfield in the south and the foothills of the Sierra to the east. Wallace Smith, in his seminal history of the Central Valley entitled Garden of the Sun, which is extraordinary in its scope and also horribly infused with racist and misogynistic statements and bias, Wallace Smith writes, "The word Yokuts is both singular and plural in form, hence the proper way to say one Yokuts or several Yokuts." There were between 50 and 60 different Yokuts tribes, depending on what source you look at. It is estimated that prior to the Spanish, Mexican, and American genocides of the Yokuts, there were about 70,000 Yokuts living in the Central Valley. In fact, our valley had one of the highest regional population densities in indigenous North America. After enduring multiple genocides, it is estimated that there are 2,500 Yokuts alive today. To talk about the history of the Yokuts, we have to begin, well, at the beginning. According to historians Damon B. Akins and William J. Bauer, Jr., indigenous people begin their history with creation stories. These creation stories define a people and a land. Thus, the history of indigenous people in California began when creators made the land and the people. As told by the Tachi Yokuts, whose ancestral homelands sit in the southern San Joaquin Valley, this is how their world came to be. Long ago, eagle and coyote sat on a spit of land in a vast ocean. Turtle swam over to them. Eagle asked Turtle to dive to the bottom of the sea and bring back dirt. Turtle gulped as much air as he could and dove. He struggled to reach the ocean's floor and managed to grab only a tiny handful of dirt. Turtle breached the water and flopped exhausted on the island with Coyote and Eagle. In doing so, much of the dirt washed out of Turtle's hand. Coyote inspected Turtle's hand and nearly gave up hope of finding soil, any soil at all, when he spied a bit of mud underneath Turtle's fingernail. Eagle and Coyote mixed the dirt with chia seeds to make the earth. Then Eagle and Coyote made human beings out of earth's soil and then sent those people throughout the earth. They told the Tachi Yokuts, "You go to the Central Valley, go to that place with your people." Historians Damon B. Adkins and William J. Bauer Jr. note that creation stories describe the relationship between California's indigenous people and the land. First, creators made indigenous people out of the land itself. Second, indigenous people developed ways of working with the land. Finally, California's indigenous people lived with the land in complex social, political, and economic networks. They built towns, coordinated or cooperated or fought with their neighbors, and extended trade routes to reach those farthest away. The Tachi Yokuts write, "The Yokuts lived a simple life, depending on the land for food, clothing, and shelter. They are called the seed gatherers because they did no farming in the days before the Europeans appeared. Their main food was acorns. They made simple clothing out of bark and grass. Their jewelry and headbands were made of seeds and feathers. The Yokuts found life in the California Valley to be pleasant and peaceful for centuries. This is the Central Valley. The land of the Yokuts people is the land in purple." Wallace Smith writes, "The northernmost group of the Yokuts consisted of 10 tribes. The Pitcachi made their home south of the San Joaquin River around Herndon and Sycamore Point, and south over the low-lying plains to where Fresno is now located. Each Yokuts tribe was divided into 2 moieties, or 2 parts, or social groupings. Smith notes that every member in the tribe belonged to one or the other of these lodges. Marriage between people in each of the 2 societies was forbidden. Each moiety had their own hereditary chief. Each chief had a jester, with duties similar to that of the medieval court fool. He ridiculed that which was sacred and jeered at those who were in authority. Two spirit people, people who were non-binary and non-gender conforming, served as tribal morticians, cremating the dead bodies. They played an important ceremonial role in the life of the tribe, and they enjoyed certain privileges. The Yokuts lived in several types of buildings. Sometimes it was a building with one large room that served as a communal space with fireplaces arranged for each family. 10 families usually occupied each common hall. Cognizant of the valley summer heat, a shade porch ran along the entire length of the house. Villages were built along water sources like streams and rivers, which were so abundant in the valley at that time. Smith notes that prior to the arrival of the European colonizers, the Yokuts usually had an abundant and variety of food: fish, fowl, gophers, rabbits, pine nuts, acorns, lizards, grass seeds, deer, and elk, which were generally available. The land was lush and green, the water widespread in this wet, fertile valley. The bow and arrow were the primary hunting tools of the Yokuts. Smith writes, picture it, on moonlit nights, bears were shot from nests high in the oak trees, while those bears fed on acorns underneath the trees. For fishing, ground buckeye nuts with earth stamped into them were mixed with nadine leaves and thrown into streams. This temporarily poisoned the water and caused the fish to float to the surface. The fish were then scooped up in baskets. This work had to be done rather quickly because the fish were not killed, merely paralyzed temporarily. But acorns were the primary food source due to the abundant oak forests all over the valley. Smith writes that acorns were used to provide flour for bread and mush, and it was ground in great mortars. Damon B. Akins and William J. Bauer Jr. say acorns sustained Central Valley indigenous life. They possess a high content of fat and vitamin B6, and that high fat allowed people to survive the lean winter months. The Yokuts were responsible stewards of the land in so many ways. The oak tree and the acorns is just one example. Akins and Bauer write, indigenous people built fires underneath oak trees to stunt the growth of weeds. This type of burning made it easier for families to harvest acorns that had been knocked to the ground. Fires also promoted the growth of straight but pliable oak shoots and deer grass, materials Yokuts used to make baskets. Fire controlled insects that might blight a year's crop. Burns took care of weevils and worms that feasted on decomposing acorns. Burning stimulated the growth of food near the oak trees. Black morel mushrooms, for instance, thrive in black oak forests that have been burned. Burnt over landscapes were also easier to travel, easier to hunt on. Thus, the Yokuts worked the land to ensure its productivity. Rituals, religious rituals, played an important role in the life of the Yokuts. Group ceremonies often included shamanic displays of great
spiritual power. One informational website says that the most important ritual for the Yokuts was the annual mourning ceremony, a 6-day ritual held in the fall to honor the dead who had passed away during the previous year. The ceremony involved symbolic killing, the destruction of property, and the ritualized washing of mourners. Perhaps it was a harbinger of things to come.
This Yokut centuries-old way of living sustainably and freely on and with the land began to be altered in shattering and deadly ways. Spanish army deserters from the mission in San Diego were the first Europeans to arrive in the Central Valley in 1770, followed by the Spanish army seeking to find them. The subsequent Spanish colonizing of the Central Valley brought disease, displacement, enslavement, death, and destruction. After Mexico secured control of California in 1822, it was more of the same. The first permanent home in the San Joaquin was made by Jose Noriega in 1836. From then till 1846, over 30 land grants were made in the valley to Mexican settlers. Akins and Bauer write, settlers' colonial policies attempted to separate indigenous peoples from the land and from each other. Mexican livestock destroyed customary food sources. Missionaries believed in tearing away indigenous people from their allegedly wild and primitive state. This led to enforced family separation. Disease took the lives of many and reduced the reproductive rate and lifespan of those who survived. Religious leaders, so-called religious leaders, assaulted indigenous people's lifeways and punished those who defied their authority with imprisonment, public flogging, and execution. Some Yokuts attempted assimilation. Others took up arms and resisted. Next came the Americans. And, writes Wallace, the 1848 discovery of gold sent Americans surging into the San Joaquin Valley, vastly outnumbering the Yokuts. The demand for beef caused a rapid growth of ranching on the valley floor, and the mighty forests of oak were cut down to make pastures. The acorn was no more. The valley's waterways were diverted to crops and to cattle. More people poured into the valley. The early trails of indigenous people were replaced by roads. Stagecoaches, in turn, were soon supplanted by railroads, which simulated and supported wheat growing. By 1882, less than 100 years after Europeans first stepped foot there, the San Joaquin Valley was the famed land of bonanza wheat fields. What was once vast forests of oak trees was now the wide, open valley we know today. The Tachi Yokut tribe writes, California has a tragic history of hostility towards its native people, including unrestrained vigilante groups that hunted native men, women, and children like game animals during the first decades of statehood, killing thousands upon thousands. The state's first governor, John McDougall, famously declared, "A war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian races become extinct." The first governor of this state. Raymond Cootie Jeff, a tribal historian, shares the following historic information on the Tachi Yokut website, from which I am quoting, and the use of the word Indian is theirs. In 1852, when our 18 treaties were not ratified, the U.S. turned its head the other way and let the state of California handle the Indian population. So for over 50 years, our genocide lasted. The timeline for the extermination of California Indians is as follows. 1856. And if we could have that slide. 1856. The state of California issued a bounty of 25 cents per Indian scalp. 1860. The state of California increased the bounty to $5 per Indian scalp. By 1903, 99% of the Tachi Yokut population were killed. During all this time, no indigenous people could individually own land. 1921, the federal government created 123 small indigenous settlements in California. 1944, the United States let California steal Yokuts land for a sale of $1.25 per acre. By 1950, the entire population of indigenous people in California totaled 22,000, compared to 394,000 before the arrival of the Europeans. The rich culture of the Yokuts lives on in the remaining Yokuts in the Central Valley and beyond. Despite repeated attempts to wipe them away, it is estimated that 2,000 remain today and are shaping the future of the Yokuts people, including our musical guest, Lance Canales. A land acknowledgement is a traditional custom that dates back centuries in many Native nations and communities. Today, land acknowledgements are used by Native people and non-Natives to recognize the indigenous peoples whose ancestral homeland is the land on which we now live. And so, we acknowledge that our Alluvial Avenue church campus sits within the traditional homelands of the Yokuts, the past, present, and future stewards of this land. Que así sea, bendito sea. May it be so. Blessed be. Amen.